They said I owed the HOA $200. Just $200. No letters, no warnings, just a notice taped to my front door saying my home was going into foreclosure. At first I thought it was a mistake. Then I realized it wasn't. This was personal. I was about to lose my house, not because I couldn't pay, but because I dared to question the wrong people. What started as a late fee turned into threats, fake fines, and a full-blown power trip. But instead of backing down, I found a loophole. And what I did next? It changed everything. How far would you go to protect your home from the people who claim to protect the neighborhood? I moved into the neighborhood thinking it was the beginning of something good. The community was quiet. The lawns were trimmed. The homes were just similar enough to feel organized, but still unique enough to feel personal. It wasn't a gated community or anything too fancy, but it had that perfect little suburb feel. A cul-de-sac where people waved when they walked their dogs, where kids rode scooters in packs, and you knew your neighbor's dog's name even if you didn't know theirs. I bought my house after years of saving. It wasn't flashy, just a modest 3-bedroom with a red brick front and a porch swing I installed myself. I worked from home, did freelance IT support, so I spent most of my time there, fixing things for clients during the day and working on home projects in the evenings. My life was pretty simple, peaceful, stable. At least it was until I missed a single payment to the HOA. Now, before you roll your eyes, no, I wasn't dodging bills or ignoring my responsibilities. It was $200, one payment. I didn't even realize I had missed it. There was no knock at the door, no phone call, no neighborly reminder. Just a letter that must have been buried in junk mail. And then silence. I didn't even think about it again, not until weeks later when I noticed a paper taped to my door. I assumed it was a flyer or some kids playing a prank, but it wasn't. It was a formal notice. Cold, emotionless. According to the HOA, I was now delinquent, and they weren't just threatening to fine me. They were beginning the process of foreclosing on my home. Over $200. That was the moment the illusion shattered. The calm, friendly community I thought I was part of? It wasn't real. Behind the flower beds and festive mailboxes were neighbors who nodded at you in the street, then voted in secret meetings to take your house. At first I told myself it had to be a misunderstanding, maybe a clerical error, maybe a new board member going a little too hard on the rules. I figured I'd call, clear it up, and move on. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized this wasn't just about a missing payment. This was about power. The HOA president, a man I'd never even spoken to, had a reputation, one I hadn't paid attention to until now. He'd taken over the board a few years ago and slowly turned what used to be a friendly, cooperative group into something else entirely. Neighbors whispered about him, how he'd fined people for wind chimes, sent warning letters over non-conforming lawn chairs, even demanded one homeowner repaint their door because it was the wrong shade of navy blue. I had stayed out of it. I thought that by keeping my head down, doing my part, and paying my dues, I'd be left alone. I was wrong, and I had no idea how far they'd go, or what I'd have to do to stop them. After finding that foreclosure notice taped to my front door, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the HOA. I assumed someone would explain the mix-up, maybe apologize for the extreme reaction. Instead, I got routed to their attorney. No explanation, no conversation, just legal jargon and a demand for immediate payment, plus fees. Fees for processing, for legal review, for non-compliance. The total wasn't $200 anymore. It was now $148.92. Due immediately, or they'd move forward with foreclosure proceedings. I asked for a breakdown. They emailed me a spreadsheet so vague it could have been made up on the spot. Administrative costs, lie-in filing fees, HOA board labor compensation. What does that even mean? I sent a certified letter contesting the charges. No response. I emailed the HOA board president directly, twice, no reply, and then things got weird. Within a week I received 2 more violations, one for improper trash bin placement and another for unapproved exterior decor. The trash bin one? Apparently I'd left my bin out for an extra hour after pickup. The decor? A small, potted plant I'd hung on the porch, the same plant that had been there for over a year. These weren't coincidences. It was coordinated. I was being targeted. My neighbors started acting differently too. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others smiled too tightly. One even warned me in a hushed voice, "You should just pay it. They don't stop." I started digging. I requested copies of past meeting minutes. I went through my HOA's bylaws line by line, and what I found was worse than I expected. This wasn't a one-time thing. The HOA president had a pattern. Under his leadership, the board had issued over a dozen foreclosure threats in the past 2 years, mostly to homeowners who had questioned fees, contested fines, or requested documentation. Most of them caved. A few sold their homes and moved out. One family tried to fight back and ended up thousands in debt after a brutal legal battle they couldn't afford. And then I found the kicker. The HOA's rules had been quietly changed. A year earlier, in a special meeting held without public notice, the president and 2 loyal board members passed a motion that gave them power to initiate foreclosure after 30 days of non-payment, with no vote from the rest of the board and no requirement to notify the homeowner beyond a single letter. 1 letter. That's it. And the president? He worked in real estate. He specialized in buying distressed properties. Let that sink in. It was starting to look a lot like a scheme, using the HOA's legal authority to create pressure, stack fees, and push homeowners toward foreclosure, all while staying within the letter of the law. I was furious. But more than that, I was scared. I wasn't just fighting for $200 anymore. I was fighting for my home. So I decided to push back. I documented everything. Screenshots of emails, photos of violations, printouts of the bylaw changes. I filed an official dispute with the HOA through certified mail. I even hired a lawyer for a consultation who confirmed that while it was shady, it wasn't necessarily illegal. The real problem? The HOA had more power than most people realize. Once you sign those papers at closing, you're bound to the rules, no matter how petty, outdated, or downright abusive they become. I thought I'd reached my limit until the next violation came in. This time, it was about my lawn. Apparently the grass was uneven in growth pattern. That was the actual wording. Not dead, not overgrown, just uneven. I couldn't believe it. But when I walked outside, sure enough, there was a bright orange warning sign stuck in the middle of my yard like a scarlet letter. 2 days. Later I got a letter stating I was being fined $75 a day until the lawn was in compliance. I'd had enough. I stopped playing defense. I attended the next HOA board meeting. It was held in a community center down the road, one of those bland beige rooms with foldable chairs and a projector that no one knows how to use. About 20 people showed up, mostly retirees and longtime residents who didn't seem to care much unless someone mentioned noise complaints or property values. I stood up to speak during the open comments portion, and I laid it all out. I told them about the surprise foreclosure threat, the ridiculous violations, the sudden spike in fees. I quoted the bylaws. I read off the names of other residents who had been threatened in the past 2 years. I even pulled out a copy of the revised foreclosure clause and asked who in the room had voted for it. The president sat at the end of the table, stone-faced, arms crossed. He didn't interrupt me, didn't flinch, didn't respond at all. But others in the room? They listened. Some looked uncomfortable, a few looked angry. And when I was done, someone in the back asked a question that changed everything. "Wait, we can vote him out, right?" The president chuckled and brushed it off. That's not how it works. But it was. Buried deep in the HOA's founding documents was a provision for a special recall election. No one had ever used it before. But the rules were clear. If I could get signatures from at least 25% of homeowners, we could trigger a vote to remove the president and any other board members attached to misconduct. That became my new mission. I went door to door, sometimes in the heat, sometimes in the rain, explaining everything to my neighbors. I showed them the notices, the violations, the bylaw changes. Most of them had never seen any of it before. They had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. Some were skeptical, but many were outraged. Within a week, I had over 40 signatures, more than enough. I submitted the petition and demanded a recall vote, And that's when things got even uglier. I woke up one morning to find my mailbox smashed in. No note, no explanation, just metal twisted and glass shattered. A week later, someone filed a noise complaint against me. For using a leaf blower at 3 p.m., another anonymous tip was filed, claiming I had unlicensed construction materials on my property. What they meant was a wheelbarrow and a few bags of mulch. I wasn't just dealing with the HOA anymore. I was dealing with a man who was losing control and willing to use every dirty trick in the book to keep it. But the vote was scheduled. It was official, and what happened at that meeting would be the most dramatic moment this community had ever seen. Because when the ballots were counted, and the truth came out, the president wasn't just removed, he was exposed, and the entire neighborhood saw exactly who had been pulling the strings, and why. The night of the recall vote felt more like a courtroom showdown than a neighborhood meeting. The community center was packed, standing room only. Some people brought folding chairs from home. Others leaned against the walls, arms crossed, eyes sharp. You could feel it in the air. This wasn't just another HOA gathering. This was a reckoning. The president sat at his usual place at the front of the room, flanked by the same two board members who had rubber-stamped every fine, every violation, every shady policy for the past 2 years. He wore that smug, practiced grin, the kind that said he still believed this would all blow over. I sat in the second row, a thick binder in my lap filled with every document I'd gathered over the last 3 months. Copies of fines, screenshots of emails, bylaws, timestamps, photos. I had become an expert in HOA warfare, and tonight I was ready for battle. The meeting opened with standard procedure, minutes read, agenda reviewed, the usual robotic motions. But when we reached the recall vote, the energy in the room shifted. The board tried to control the narrative, of course. They framed the recall as unnecessary disruption. They said it was the work of a disgruntled homeowner with a personal vendetta. They said removing the president would cause chaos and uncertainty. Then they handed me the microphone. I didn't yell. I didn't rant. I just told the truth. I walked the room through what had happened, calmly, clearly, and with evidence. I showed them the foreclosure notice, the absurd violations, the fines. I showed them the clause buried in the revised bylaws that gave the president unchecked power to initiate foreclosure over minor infractions, without community vote or oversight. Then I showed them the records. Public records, the ones that proved. The president had acquired 3 homes in the neighborhood over the last 18 months, each from a homeowner who'd faced sudden violations, stacked fines, and threats of foreclosure. And guess what? Every one of those homes had been sold at a loss, fast-tracked through legal pressure, then quietly flipped or rented out under an LLC, registered in his wife's name. The room went silent. You could hear the soft shifting of chairs. Someone cleared their throat nervously. A woman in the back muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. I continued. I showed emails between board members, obtained through a records request, where they discussed targeting specific properties they considered neglected or underleveraged. One email even suggested that a homeowner who questioned a fine should be taught a lesson before others start getting brave. People started whispering. Some were visibly angry. One older man stood up and asked if his own foreclosure threat had been part of this pattern. Another neighbor, someone who hadn't spoken to me in months, walked over and quietly apologized. Then the president stood. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try to explain it away. He just smiled and said, "You people don't understand how an HOA works. This is about keeping your property values up. If you don't like it, vote me out." So we did. The ballots were simple. Yes or no. It took 45 minutes to count them. During that time, the tension in the room was unbearable. People paced, whispered. Some just stared at the floor, arms folded, eyes hard. The president sat quietly at the front table, staring straight ahead like none of it mattered. But it did. When the final tally was read aloud, the room erupted. Percent voted to remove the president. 68% voted to remove both of his supporting board members. They were out, effective immediately. The vote wasn't even close. For the first time in years, the community had taken its power back. But the real shock came next. One of the outgoing board members, clearly rattled by the result, tried to resign quietly and slip out the side door. But before she could, a resident stood up and shouted, "Tell them about the bonuses." The room fell silent again. That's when we learned that the board had voted, privately, to award themselves financial compensation for extra administrative labor, thousands of dollars per year, paid out quietly, with no oversight or community approval. It wasn't just abuse of power, it was theft, and it had been happening for years. What started as a personal fight for my own home had now exposed an entire system of corruption. The people who had fined residents over lawn chairs and potted plants were lining their pockets behind closed doors, while hiding behind rules no one knew existed. By the end of the night, the police were called, not because of violence or chaos, but because someone reported financial fraud. The HOA's records were frozen for audit. Bank statements were requested. A full investigation was launched by the state HOA Oversight Office. And as for the president, he left without saying a word, walked right out the door, past the neighbors he used to manipulate, his shoulders hunched, his face blank. No farewell, no apology. But the damage was already done, and the fallout was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up to something I hadn't seen in months. A quiet porch, an empty mailbox, and no new violation slips. But what came next wasn't just peace. It was an opportunity. Because with the president gone and the board dismantled, there was a vacancy. And I had just been nominated to take his place. 2 weeks after the vote, I stood in front of a small but determined group of neighbors, holding a clipboard and a mug of lukewarm coffee. We weren't meeting in a fancy boardroom or behind closed doors. We were standing outside in the open, under the old oak tree at the center of the neighborhood park. The place where kids usually played tag or rode scooters in circles was now the birthplace of something new. A clean slate, because after the recall vote and the explosive discovery of financial abuse by the previous board, the HOA was effectively decapitated. 3 of the 5 board members were removed, and the remaining 2, under pressure and intense scrutiny, resigned within days. With the audit underway, the HOA's funds were frozen, their lawyer mysteriously stopped returning emails, and the community was left in limbo. No leadership, no direction, just angry, confused residents and a growing sense that something needed to change. Fast. That's when I was nominated. I didn't plan to run. I didn't want the role. I had spent months fighting to keep my house, not fighting for a seat at the head of the table. But people started stopping me on the sidewalk, leaving notes on my door. One neighbor even rang my bell just to say, "We need someone who actually gives a damn." So I said yes, not because I wanted the title, but because I wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else in our neighborhood again. The first board meeting under the new leadership looked nothing like the old regime. No hidden clauses, no private votes. We opened every agenda item to the full community. We live-streamed meetings for those who couldn't attend in person. We formed small advisory committees so people could have input on real issues, not whether someone's lawn was a half-inch too high. And we rewrote the bylaws from the ground up. Gone were the 30-day foreclosure clauses and vague non-compliance citations. We implemented clear guidelines, actual grace periods, and mandatory homeowner notification policies. No action could be taken without a transparent process, and no one, especially not the president, could single-handedly trigger legal action again. But the real work started when we dove into the HOA's financials. The audit revealed what many feared. The board had misused funds for years. Thousands of dollars in discretionary expenses that had no receipts. HOA funded reimbursements to the former president's real estate business. Even luxury dinners labeled as planning meetings. It was fraud, plain and simple. The HOA insurance company stepped in. Civil charges were filed. The former president's real estate license was suspended pending investigation. Rumors spread that federal authorities were getting involved, though I can't confirm how deep the case went, only that it went far enough to make him disappear from the neighborhood entirely. He sold his home quietly one weekend and left town. No goodbye, no note, nothing. And in his absence, something incredible started happening. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started chatting again. Front porches filled up with plants, decorations, and yes, even wind chimes. A retired veteran, who'd been fined for flying a flag from his mailbox, raised it again, this time with the support of the entire block. People felt like they belonged again. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still debates over budgets, landscaping, and yes, even trash bin placement. But it was different now, because it wasn't about control anymore. It was about community. And as for me, I kept my home. I paid the original $200, not because I had to, but because I wanted to close the chapter properly. The bogus fines were dropped, the foreclosure process was reversed, my name was cleared, and my credit restored. But more importantly, I learned something that changed how I saw everything. HOAs are only as dangerous as the people in charge of them. And if no one pays attention, if no one asks questions, challenges, decisions, or pushes back against bad leadership, it doesn't take much for something meant to protect a community to become the very thing that tears it apart. Because here's the truth, most people don't want to hear. HOA boards aren't full of villains, but they do attract people who love control more than community. That's why people like the former president get away with so much. Not because they're smart, or powerful, or invincible, but because they count on the rest of us being too busy, too tired, or too polite to push back. That's the real danger, and it's also where the real power lies, with regular homeowners, who decide they're done being quiet, who decide to show up, speak out, and take back control. It's funny. When I think back to the moment I found that foreclosure notice taped to my front door, I remember feeling small, powerless, alone. But now, I see that moment for what it really was, a spark, because the second you stop assuming someone else will fix it, the second you realize you have a voice, a vote, a right to fight back, the game changes. It doesn't matter if it's a $200 fine, a petty violation, or a bully with a clipboard and a title. You have more power than you think. So the next time your HOA sends you a violation, ask questions, demand transparency. Don't let fear or silence become compliance. Because if they can take your home over $200, imagine what they'll do when no one's watching.